I love SpongeBob SquarePants. I've pretty much had a lifelong obsession with the show. It came free with my autism.
Well, someone had to do it.
However, there perhaps isn't another animated series out there with a legacy as turbulent as this. It's a story I'm sure we're all aware of. I definitely don't need to explain that. Following its premiere after the Kids' Choice Awards in 1999, the surreal and witty show about a talking sea sponge and his underwater friends captured the hearts of people across all age groups, becoming beloved for its unbridled positive energy, lovable characters, and the apex of a style of comedy that had been perfected across several Nicktoons in years prior. In practically no time at all, what began as a simple passion project from the mind of marine biologist turned animator Steven Hillenburg grew into one of the biggest pop culture icons of the past century, which meant a never-ending supply of merchandise that made the very malleable face of our upbeat yellow protagonist practically inescapable. Despite the show's phenomenal success, by the end of the third season, the crew felt it was time to wrap things up. Thus, they came together to create the SpongeBob movie.
Prepare to dive!
Set to be the grand finale of the story with a narrative that saw the talking cheese on a quest to save his world, while also finding self-acceptance and proving his childlike sense of wonder doesn't make him any less capable than others. It's a surprisingly touching story that expands on themes that had always been present in the show and was able to give most of its major characters a definitive happy ending. Thus, as the most beautiful credit sequence of any movie came to a close, it was time to say goodbye to our little porous yellow friend.
That's the end of SpongeBob.
Until the film made over $140 million at the worldwide box office, becoming Nickelodeon's highest grossing film at that time. That, plus the fact merchandise was still flying off the shelves, meant executives were having second thoughts about letting go of this media empire they had. So another season was put into production, with only a few key staff members returning as most had already moved on to other projects. This included Hillenburg, who stepped into the role of executive producer, being succeeded as showrunner by Paul Tibbitt, a writer, storyboard artist, and director on the first 3 seasons, and a mostly unfamiliar writing team starting on a still relatively new but insanely popular series matched with a network that began applying pressure for more episodes, especially after they caught the stupid virus and disregarded every other show they had to put all their eggs into this one basket, was not the best recipe for success. It was clear this was no longer the same show that captivated the world, and people were taking notice. Over the following years, the series would become less whimsical and more mean-spirited, while the beloved characters would be condensed into a few simplistic traits, making them far less likable. Now, as someone who was born in 2001, I have a different view on these middle seasons, and perhaps it's because these were the first episodes I remember watching as they premiered, but I still feel there is a lot of merit to them that people don't talk about.
This is a load of barnacles.
I heard that!
While the writing may not have been quite as sharp most of the time, I appreciate how much more experimental and ambitious the stories became, and despite what I said about making the characters unlikable, whenever they were written well, they could turn out some introspective and occasionally emotional moments, not to mention the huge upgrade Plankton got. Episodes like Patrick's Smart Pants, Driven to Tears, Krusty Towers, New Digs, Donut of Shame, Not Normal, Nautical Novice, A Life in a Day, Overbooked, No Hat for Pat, Sandcastles in the Sand, Enchanted Tiki Dreams, Perfect Chemistry, and many more showcase how much talent was still going into the series.
Perhaps you and your yellow friend would like to set up a timeshare plan. Don't do it, Sandy!
But that isn't the narrative that has plagued the series for the past 20 years. Seasons 1 to 3 were a near perfect show, the movie was great, then everything after was trash. To many, the book has already been written here. Despite my defense of these seasons, I did fall off watching the show around 2011, which was less to do with the quality of the episodes themselves and more so being carried away in the new wave of modern story-driven and emotionally complex shows. By the early 2010s, SpongeBob, while still popular, was a far cry from how ubiquitous it had been a decade ago. The series had entered a bizarre reality where its relevancy was being primarily fueled by people who grew up during the Golden Age, taking moments from those old episodes and transforming them, changing the original context and meaning trying to give them new life. While it's great seeing people celebrate this thing we all grew up with, the fact this franchise was basically being kept alive by people who weren't even watching the show anymore was a clear indication something needed to change.
Bar the door!
Got it.
In 2015, Nickelodeon Movies released their first feature film based on one of their series in 11 years, the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water. And from the very first teaser trailer, something felt different. The writing had that energetic and playful tone that had been missing from the previous seasons. The characters were feeling like their old selves, and the jokes were actually funny.
Welcome to the apocalypse, Mr. Squidward. I hope you like leather.
In part, the reason for that was the return of Steven Hillenburg and some of the old crew members, which led to a film that harkened back to those early years while also reminding people why they fell in love with these characters in the first place, ending up grossing $325 million worldwide. Thanks to his second film, SpongeBob was enjoying a high point in popularity and success he hadn't experienced in quite a few years, though the question on everyone's mind was, could the show itself be revitalized?
Sure. I don't know. Why not?
Due to the film, the show had been placed on a lengthy production hiatus right in the middle of its 9th season, where it was decided to completely shake up the crew. Again. Paul Tibbitt was succeeded as showrunner by Vincent Waller and Mark Cesarelli, and the established writing staff were replaced with a mix of new talent from more modern shows and some returning from the original run, such as Kaz, who penned some of the most iconic episodes including Wet Painters, Chocolate with Nuts, and I Had an Accident. This was paired with the announcement Hillenburg would be returning to work on the series in a more active role than he had been ever since 2004. After much build-up and speculation, new episodes finally started rolling out in summer of 2015, and it seemed almost every change found in Sponge Out of Water made its way back into the show just as many hoped. Gone was the mean-spirited tone, and the damage that had been done to the characters was near instantly reversed. Even the visuals became much more lively and fun again, which was all due to a significant change in their approach to making new episodes. Ever since the beginning, the series had been entirely storyboard driven, meaning the episodes were written as they were drawn. However, when they changed over staff, this was shifted to being more script driven, meaning episodes were outlined beat for beat before picking up any pencils. While both methods have their ups and downs, and neither is necessarily better than the other, this change in production allowed the crew to put more of their focus into keeping their portrayals of these characters consistent. And those who were curious enough to see what the show had been up to tended to agree that
Hey, SpongeBob's back!
there were still some duds here and there, as is to be expected with season 9 of any show, but the crew had seemingly done the impossible and fixed almost every issue from the past. Almost. In trying so adamantly to recapture that classic vibe, they had created many stories that felt quite derivative, which is not a fault of the team at all, especially considering by this point there had already been over 400 stories told using these characters. When production on season 9 finally came to a close, it became clear that the crew couldn't keep trying to simply replicate what the show was 12 years ago. If they were going to keep SpongeBob fresh and interesting, they were going to have to majorly shake it up. Because of the strain Sponge Out of Water put on production of the series, the previously announced 10th season was heavily scaled back, with Nickelodeon ordering 13 episodes instead of 26. This was the opportunity the crew needed to experiment with the very foundation of the show to create something wholly new while still feeling quite familiar. One of the most charming things about early SpongeBob were moments where the characters would shapeshift or be distorted to either punctuate a joke or act as a fun visual, taking advantage of the fact these characters are invertebrates.
Look at me! I got no bones!
Meaning they could be squashed and stretched in countless ways. However, this was yet another aspect of the show that became somewhat lost over time due to a more demanding production schedule. It was decided this new direction would take inspiration from other classic 90s Nicktoons, some of which the crew members had also worked on, though with a modern twist. They were going to transform SpongeBob into an off-the-wall comedy, turning the nautical nonsense up to 11 by giving the series a massive facelift. This meant dramatically increasing the number of storyboards drawn per episode, which gave way for more fast-paced and fluent animation with an emphasis on heavily exaggerated expressions and posing for the characters that simply look gorgeous. We'll talk about how people reacted to this change in a second, but I want to just appreciate the animation style of these newer seasons for a moment. SpongeBob is one of the few cartoons still being drawn entirely on paper, so seeing its visuals become so consistently energetic and creative, taking full advantage of the medium, it really does look fantastic. And I feel this also gives the series a huge advantage in terms of slapstick. Because of the more solid animation from episodes in the early 2010s, whenever a character, namely Squidward, would be hurt as a joke, it was rarely ever funny because often the injury wasn't exaggerated enough to escape the realistic implications. There is a huge difference between this
Oops. Oh, yeah, that one's the can opener.
and this. In recent seasons, this is no longer a problem because the animation is already so over the top, reality just isn't a factor. It also does help that the series no longer dwells on moments of the characters in serious pain. While season 10 was mostly well received, in the following years this new direction for the show has garnered a significant backlash. I've seen people saying that the show is worse than ever now, that it's lost its identity, foregoing smart writing for
Look at the funny face! Doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Look at the funny face! Look at the funny face!
And this viewpoint is also held by people who mostly grew up on those middle seasons, proving the more things change, the more they stay the same. Now, of course, I'm gonna say, everyone is free to dislike the current state of the show and think the change in animation wasn't the right move. Regardless of how much this series means to many of us, we're still only talking about a cartoon here. It's not that deep. However, saying these new episodes have forsaken everything that made SpongeBob great and soiled its good name is a statement I simply can't agree with, thus why I felt strongly enough to make this a video. Because the politics of the SpongeBob fandom used to be a big part of YouTube, at least in terms of animation discussion, for better and for worse. There is no shortage of videos on this site from a decade ago talking about the series' fall from grace, picking apart its very worst episodes, or lamenting the slow demise of this once amazing show. However, by the time Sponge Out of Water rolled around, all of that had kind of come to an end. Don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of videos about the series, but I haven't really seen anyone delve into season 10 and onwards to have a nuanced discussion about this current era of the show, so that's what I'm gonna try and do. The main point of why the show has become so enjoyable again is the course correction the crew took with all the characters, restoring them to their former glory, so to speak. You can see slight changes in everyone, but I really want to highlight Patrick and Mr. Krabs, who were the characters that became the most derailed during the middle seasons, with the former being dumbed down to a point where he lost any sense of self-awareness as to how his actions impact others, and the latter losing all his morals in his obsession with monetary gain. The thing about Patrick that a lot of people seem to misunderstand is there has to be layers to his stupidity. He isn't saying dumb non sequitur lines for the sake of it, there is an internal logic behind everything. The comedy of Patrick isn't that he says and does stupid stuff, it's that he says and does it with 100% conviction. That's why the original joke of this dynamic was the clearly more intelligent SpongeBob fully believed Patrick was a genius and would always listen to his bad advice, which often gets him in trouble.
She wears a hat full of air.
Do you mean she puts on airs?
I guess so.
That's just fancy talk.
But beyond that, he genuinely cared about his best friend and was always there to support him. Both these elements of Patrick saw a comeback in recent seasons, though it's the latter that really saved his character. Because while the show can still struggle to understand the inner machinations of Patrick, his friendship with SpongeBob cannot be questioned. Whether it's standing up for his best friend after he's been taken advantage of, or going through great lengths to do something nice for him simply because he wants to. It also does help that he still gets a lot of the good lines.
Boy, is that guy gonna be mad when he gets home!
Then there's Mr. Krabs, who through seasons 4 to 8 became consumed by greed and lost his redeeming qualities, those being his love for his daughter and his role as SpongeBob's mentor, which were the only things he valued more than his bottom line. Most of the time. Then later you get him gleefully singing about how he'd trade Pearl for some cash or firing SpongeBob so he can save a nickel, though now all of these have been reinstated. One of the very first episodes of this new era was Tutor Sauce, an episode about Mr. Krabs attempting to teach SpongeBob how to drive, where he never once gets angry at him despite all the damage he causes. And we also see him just casually give Pearl money without second thought. In a perfect world, I wouldn't be praising the show for doing the bare minimum to stay in line with the original characterization, but when we went close to a decade without them, it's been so pleasant seeing these softer sides of the characters become more pronounced again. However, all that focuses on the show either sticking to or returning to those native guidelines, which while appreciated, would not be enough to save the series, as previously discussed. So what changes have the show implemented to bring back the creativity and imagination that had long since started to fade?
No, wait, don't tell me. Don't tell me! Don't tell me! I can do this! Don't tell me! Okay, tell me.
When putting together this new direction for the series, the main issue the crew had to remedy was the stagnation of the show's writing, trying to keep coming up with new and inventive ideas that were able to stand on their own without feeling like rehashes of earlier concepts, while also staying true to the characters and the world. This initiative turned out to be deceptively simple, because the overall aim was to find some way to generate fresh story ideas without undergoing any major shake-ups to the basic setup of the series, else they risk tarnishing a near 20-year-old winning formula. Many shows in this position tend to resort to adding new members of the main cast, which while that method can be successful, more often than not these additional characters feel forced when brought into an established group that have already had years developing their chemistry. The staff making SpongeBob fully understood that they could not mess with the primary characters, especially not after all the work they had just put into making them consistently likable again. Instead, they did something I don't think anyone saw coming. They started devoting more storylines to previously tertiary characters such as Karen or Mrs. Puff, while also bringing back iconic one-offs from previous seasons as new recurring characters. The prime example is Bubble Bass, a fan favourite character who was introduced in the season 1 episode Pickles as a rival of SpongeBob, where he proceeded to make a few short appearances in other early stories before disappearing until a sudden cameo in a random season 8 episode. Then starting in season 9B, he was being included in storylines regularly again, exploring his home life and relationships with the other characters, though while still maintaining his obnoxious and antagonistic personality. Let me put it this way. In the original run, SpongeBob, Squidward, Patrick and Mr. Krabs were the main characters who were central to most episodes. Then Gary, Sandy and Plankton were the secondary characters who appeared a good amount of times per season. Then Mrs. Puff, Pearl, Larry and, debatably Karen, were the tertiary characters, who had 1 or 2 major appearances per year, but most of the time just got cameos. Then when season 4 rolled around, Sandy and Plankton got promoted to main character status, while Mrs. Puff, Pearl and Karen got bumped to secondary character status, which was great for them, but it left this void in the cast where the longer the show went on, the more this once bustling town of undersea life started to feel empty. The show had Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy as well as the Flying Dutchman, but those appearances were very rare. Then take a look at how the series operates now, where SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, Mr. Krabs, Sandy and Plankton are the main characters, Mrs. Puff, Pearl, Karen and Gary are the supporting players, but then you have Bubble Bass, Larry, Fred, Norman the Mailman, Old Man Jenkins, Rube,
Amazing!
Lady Mildred, Uptown, CCC, XXXIII, and a whole slew of others. They even went so far as to make the French narrator a fully realised character. Whether they were created 2 years ago or 20 years ago, they started making regular appearances as either part of a story or merely as a face in the crowd. There have been some complaints labelling this change as pandering to older fans, trying to hide the faults of the new seasons with excessive callbacks to the classic era, which isn't how I see it at all. For the first 15 years of its life, SpongeBob was a series that rejected any semblance of continuity. Protagonists' backstories or family members could change episode to episode, and iconic incidental characters would appear in one episode, then disappear forever, with a handful of exceptions. This, of course, wasn't a bad thing, as it allowed for a lot more freedom and spontaneity with the jokes and stories. But as the show marched on, this aspect also contributed to the aforementioned feeling of emptiness Bikini Bottom started to have. Another thing we have to keep in mind is that despite a few show veterans, a lot of the talent behind SpongeBob these days are younger people. People who likely grew up watching the show themselves. When taking these factors into account, I find the decision to build a greater sense of cohesion for the world by utilising these older characters to be quite a brilliant one. It makes Bikini Bottom feel like a more concrete, lived-in place rather than just a backdrop for SpongeBob's misadventures, because instead of just nameless background fish, the scenes are now filled with distinct familiar faces, further adding to the visual flair of modern episodes. A standout example of how the show has found new life by experimenting with its cast is the Gal Pals, where they revealed Sandy, Mrs. Puff and Karen to make up a friend group who constantly hang out together, giving the show a chance to simultaneously explore some new interactions between the cast and flesh out its female characters who have always had an issue of being tethered to the more narratively important male characters. While this was such a weird yet interesting concept that made for a very entertaining story, the best thing about it is the fact they didn't come up with this great dynamic and then forget about it, because they did a follow-up episode the very next season, delving more into the history of the group and inducting Pearl as a new member. This is the sort of development and progression of ideas that you rarely used to see in SpongeBob, so I'm hoping this is a trend they'll keep up with and we can have more Gal Pal adventures in the future, because I cannot get enough of this. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how the show has been able to revitalise itself through unique and interesting character pair-ups, which mainly comes down to how the show has finally let go of this idea that SpongeBob has to be the focus all the time. Because there were times in the past when the show attempted these sorts of exciting team-ups, but they also had to force SpongeBob in there, only serving to highlight how most of these characters don't really have that much in common outside of their one mutual friend. The newer seasons have become much more comfortable with letting the yellow lad take a back seat, appearing as a quick gag or cameo and allowing others to have the focus. So we get episodes like Whale Watching, a surprisingly tender story about Squidward babysitting Pearl while also still being hilarious.
Oh no! Maybe if we get it on ice, they can reattach it!
Or something like Teacher's Pests, where Krabs and Plankton have to attend Mrs. Puff's boating school, adding a new spin to their rivalry by placing it in the context of a classroom. Or Swamp Mates, where Patrick and Bubble Bass are forced to go on a dangerous adventure together. Not all of these experiments work, mind you. Episodes can still fall flat or feel too similar to previous stories. That is just the inevitability of a show that has been on for this long. But the fact they are still generating so many new ideas and finding ways to experiment with the characters this far in is a commendable feat. This much heavier focus on continuity has even allowed the writers to correct some past mistakes, revisiting earlier concepts and taking advantage of their untapped potential. The season 2 episode Krusty Love sees Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff start dating, and while it's mostly a story focused on SpongeBob's frustration with the extenuating circumstances, the two do make a very cute couple, so it was sad to see the show just never address this again, especially when the episode ended on a rather happy note for the two of them. They did expand on this in the comics, but never in the show again. Even in later episodes, whenever the two had to interact, any history between them was either ambiguously glossed over or simply ignored, because any threat to the status quo, however minor, is still a threat to the status quo, and any threat to the status quo is a no-go on this show. You know? So it completely caught me off guard when during the season 10 premiere, this happened.
Mrs. Puff, we've been dating for 16 years now, so I was sincerely hoping that today might finally be the day that...
Yes, Eugene?
Did I steal a little kiss?
while this would have been a fun one-off gag to do as a reference to the earlier episode, especially with the 16 years line, after this the two have been shown multiple times to be in a committed relationship. They changed that status quo, adding a new dimension to both characters while still not affecting all that much. Another example is Plankton's pet amoeba Spot, who was the focus of a single season 9 episode before randomly reappearing in season 11 and becoming a mainstay. To me, what makes current SpongeBob work is that it's kind of this compound of all the greatest elements from the previous eras of the show, and I do mean all previous eras. So you end up with a show that has the same whimsical tone and likable characters as the early seasons, married with the more ambitious storytelling of the middle seasons. Then on top of that, you add the new expressive animation that makes for some of the most creative sequences you'll find in a modern cartoon, and an expanded cast of minor characters. As for the humour, that too has evolved, in that the show now includes a lot more visual gags to complement the change in animation, though this isn't a replacement for the show's smart writing like some claim. Season 10 did lean heavily in this direction, which I'd chalk up to growing pains more than anything, because the types of humour in season 11 onwards are far more balanced.
I wonder how deep it is.
I'll check. Don't bother jumping. That shaft has no bottom.
And I have to mention perhaps one of my favourite jokes from the show as of late.
Won't you? Entree.
One entree later.
I don't know, I just find the idea of the French narrator having to pause to make himself sound even more French very funny. However, all of this has just been my opinion. People are still going to dislike the modern seasons because it's different than what we grew up with, and that's perfectly fine. My purpose in making this video is less to convince people of the quality of the new episodes, and more to explain why the series has gone in this direction by looking at it from the perspective of the people actually making the series. Because the staff realised if SpongeBob is going to continue indefinitely, adjustments needed to be made. And when you take into account how many long-running shows get caught in a rut mainly due to their reluctance to change anything, to see a popular series after over 20 years still be so willing to experiment with itself and adapt to remain interesting, it is something laudable. Until next time folks, I've been the Gladding Gladiator, and so long as these pants are square and this sponge is Bob, I will continue to watch and love this show.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
As always, a huge thank you to my Patreon patrons such as The Wacky Deli, Torai Matson, Blast6, Tomb for Thought, and Toby Fangor. If you like what I do and want to help support the future of the channel, as well as gain access to a bunch of fun perks, becoming a patron is the best way to do so. I also have YouTube membership available. Link and button can be found below. And while you're down there, why not leave a comment telling me your favourite SpongeBob memory? This franchise remains one of my most enduring special interests, so I would love to discuss it more with you. Thanks so much for watching folks, and I'll see ya real soon.